America's largest mansion has a dark secret. Biltmore explained the dark secret of America's largest mansion. Biltmore, a name that sounds like a fairy tale, a house that defies the word house. 4 acres under one roof, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall that could swallow a cathedral. Beautiful, yes, magnificent, undeniable. But beneath the limestone and oak, beneath the electric chandeliers and the stained glass, there is another story. A story of invisible hands. Of coal dust and exhaustion. Of a dream so expensive it nearly destroyed the family who built it. Behind the postcard image lies a question nobody wanted to answer. What does it cost to build paradise? And who really pays the price? Not just in dollars, but in lives, in labor, in choices made in desperation. This is not the story they tell you on the guided tour. This is the story of what happens when beauty becomes an obsession, when a house becomes a burden, when a dream refuses to die, no matter how much it demands. If you're ready to go deep into the hidden history of Gilded Age America, into the economics, the sacrifices, and the secrets that built the largest private home ever constructed in this country, stay with me. Because what you're about to discover will change the way you see wealth, architecture, and the American dream itself. Let's begin. Christmas Eve, 1895. The Blue Ridge Mountains wear snow like a crown. The air cuts cold and clean, carrying the scent of wood fires and evergreen. Beyond the iron gates, past the winding road that climbs through forest thick enough to block the sun, stands something that shouldn't exist. Not here, not in the American South, not anywhere. A French chateau transplanted whole from the Loire Valley, rising from North Carolina soil as if conjured by will alone. Biltmore. The name itself is an invention. George Vanderbilt combined built, his family's ancestral Dutch town, with more, an Old English word for rolling upland. A name that sounds European, aristocratic, eternal. The house matches the ambition, 4 acres beneath a single roof, 35 bedrooms, though the exact count depends on how you define bedroom. 65 fireplaces, each one different, each one fed by a coal system so complex it required full-time engineers. 43 bathrooms at a time when indoor plumbing was still a luxury in most American homes. A banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling. A library holding 10,000 volumes. A winter garden under glass where tropical plants thrived through mountain winters. An indoor pool. A bowling alley. An organ, elevators, electric lights throughout. Central heating. Refrigeration. Fire alarms, telephones. Every modern convenience 1895 could offer, wrapped in a shell designed to look 500 years old. Stand at the entrance on that Christmas Eve and look up. Stone rises for 3 stories. A barrel-vaulted ceiling carries carved oak so intricate it seems impossible that human hands shaped it. The floor is polished marble. The staircase, a double flight leading to a landing where stained glass filters winter light into pools of red and gold and blue. The scale is deliberately overwhelming. You are meant to feel small. You are meant to understand that you have entered a different world where the ordinary rules do not apply, and you would be right. Because keeping this world alive required resources on a scale that would eventually break even Vanderbilt wealth. But on Christmas Eve of 1895, none of that mattered. George Vanderbilt stood in his entrance hall, surrounded by family and friends, and believed he had built something permanent. A refuge, a library. A place where he could think and read and manage forests according to scientific principles. A place that would outlast him. He was right about that last part. But the cost of that survival would be higher than anyone standing in that glowing hall could possibly imagine. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the man who made this place. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born in 1862 into a family that defined American wealth. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, built an empire of steamships and railroads that made him the richest man in America. When Cornelius died in 1877, he left a fortune estimated at over $100 million. In today's terms, adjusting for inflation and economic scale, that would be somewhere north of $200 billion. The Vanderbilt fortune was not old money. It was raw, recent, and immense. George's father, William Henry Vanderbilt, doubled that fortune. By the time William died in 1885, he was worth roughly $200 million, making him the wealthiest man in the world. When that fortune was divided among his children, George received approximately $10 million outright, plus substantial income from trust funds and investments. He was 23 years old. He would never work a day in a conventional job. He would never need to. And unlike his brothers and sisters who built palaces in Newport and New York, who threw parties that made headlines, who raced yachts and collected scandals, George disappeared into books. He was shy, soft-spoken, uncomfortable in crowds. He avoided the society pages his siblings dominated. He preferred libraries to ballrooms, languages to horses. He spoke 8 languages fluently: French, German, Italian, Spanish, and several others. He collected rare books with the intensity other men reserved for racehorses or mistresses. He traveled constantly, mostly to Europe, studying architecture, visiting great estates, absorbing how land and buildings could function as a single, purposeful system. By his mid-20s, George had formed a vision. He wanted a private retreat, not a showpiece for entertaining, though it would certainly impress. Not a summer cottage, though it would be comfortable. He wanted a year-round residence. A working estate, a place where he could live quietly, manage forests scientifically, and build a library worthy of a serious scholar. He wanted, in short, to create in America what the great families of Europe had built over centuries. A seat, an estate, a legacy. The question was where. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina with his mother. The town sat in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was cool and clean, a natural draw for wealthy northerners escaping summer heat and city pollution. The scenery was dramatic, ridges layered into the distance, forests thick with oak and chestnut, rivers cutting through steep valleys. The Southern Railway had recently extended service to Asheville, making it accessible without making it crowded. George was captivated. He saw possibility. Land was cheap. The climate was temperate. The views were extraordinary. And unlike Newport or the Hudson Valley, where every Vanderbilt and a store already had a palace, western North Carolina was largely untouched by Gilded Age ambition. George began buying land, not a modest plot for a country house. Thousands of acres. He purchased parcels from farmers, logged over tracts from timber companies, exhausted fields abandoned after years of careless cultivation. The acquisitions continued for years. By the time he was finished, George owned approximately 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many European principalities, larger than the city of Philadelphia. It was and remains one of the largest private land assemblies in American history, but land alone was not enough. George needed architects, landscape designers, engineers, people who could translate his vision into stone, wood, water, and working systems. He turned to the best minds available. The first was Richard Morris Hunt, America's most distinguished architect. Hunt had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so. He had designed mansions for the Astors and Belmonts. He understood scale. He understood proportion. And he understood how to make a building feel simultaneously historic and modern, rooted in European tradition but equipped with American technology. When George approached him about Biltmore, Hunt was in his 60s, at the height of his powers and reputation. He accepted the commission with enthusiasm. This would be his masterpiece. The second hire was Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect behind Central Park, the U.S. Capitol grounds, and dozens of other landmark projects. Olmsted was 70 years old when George brought him to Asheville. His philosophy was firm and uncompromising. Landscape is not decoration. It is a living system. Plants, water, topography, and soil must work together. The goal is not to dominate nature, but to reveal its potential through informed, patient intervention. Together, George, Hunt, and Olmsted formed the core team. The dream had a visionary. Now it had designers. The next step was to build, and that would require resources, logistics, and human labor on a scale North Carolina had never witnessed. The plan that emerged was audacious. Hunt designed the house in the French Renaissance chateau style, drawing directly on Loire Valley precedents like Blois, Chenonceau, and Chambord. The facade balanced symmetry with lively massing. Corner towers anchored the composition. A porte-cochere provided sheltered arrival. Steep slate roofs, dormer windows, and ornamental chimneys created a roofline that read as sculpture against the sky. Inside, the plan was equally considered. Grand public spaces, the entrance hall, the banquet hall, the library, flowed into one another with processional logic. Above, family bedrooms and guest suites offered privacy. Below, in the basement, an entire infrastructure of kitchens, storage, mechanical systems, and staff quarters formed a hidden world that made the visible world possible. Hunt specified materials with precision. Indiana limestone for the exterior walls. Durable, weather-hard, responsive to carving. The stone would be quarried, cut, numbered, and shipped by rail to Asheville. Oak for interior joinery, floors, paneling, and trim. Marble for fireplaces, floors in principal rooms, and decorative accents. Copper for the roof, chosen for its longevity and the blue-green patina it would develop over time. Every piece was numbered. Every dimension was verified. At this scale, an error was not a cosmetic flaw. It was a structural liability. Frederick Law Olmsted faced a different challenge. When he first surveyed the land George had assembled, he was dismayed. Decades of logging and careless farming had stripped the thin mountain soils. Hillsides were scarred by erosion. Creeks ran turbid after every rain. Native forests, once dense with American chestnut, oak, hickory, and tulip poplar, had been logged over or cleared for crops that quickly exhausted the ground. The land was ecologically damaged and visually tired. Olmsted's response was restorative. He refused to ring a mansion with ornamental gardens and call it a landscape. He set out to heal the land. His plan called for large-scale reforestation. Hundreds of thousands of trees would be planted. Native species would be prioritized. Erosion would be controlled through terracing, contour planting, and ground covers that stabilized soil. The approach road would be approximately 3 miles long, winding gently through recovering forest, revealing vistas in measured sequence, building anticipation. Close to the house, formal gardens would supply structure, color, and seasonal interest. Beyond them, a managed working forest would demonstrate that beauty and productivity could coexist, that scientific forestry could restore damaged land while generating income. Both Hunt and Olmsted understood that vision required infrastructure. George approved the expenditure without hesitation. A private railroad spur was extended from the Southern Railway main line directly to the construction site. A brick kiln was built on the property, firing millions of bricks for interior walls, chimneys, and service structures. A woodworking mill turned timber into flooring, paneling, and trim. A stone yard shaped and dressed limestone blocks. Temporary housing was constructed for workers. At the peak of construction, more than 1,000 men labored on the site. The workforce was diverse and skilled. Stonemasons came from Italy, bringing old-world techniques for cutting, setting, and carving. These were men who had worked on cathedrals and palaces. They knew how to cut stone so it carried load, how to set voussoirs so an arch locked itself, how to carve profiles that would weather with grace over centuries. Carpenters came from Asheville and the surrounding mountains. They were practiced in working with the region's hardwoods, oak, walnut, cherry, and they shaped the interiors with tools and techniques passed down through generations. Bricklayers, plasterers, painters, glaziers, and metalworkers added their disciplines. For many local men, this was the steadiest pay they had ever seen. The work was hard, the hours long, but the wages were reliable, and the job felt important. The logistics were staggering. Limestone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds traveled by rail from Indiana, then moved by wagon from the rail spur to the plateau. Oak beams, some more than 40 feet long, had to be hauled up narrow mountain roads. Copper sheets for the roof arrived in carefully crated bundles. Every nail, every pane of glass, every light fixture was ordered, shipped, inventoried, and installed according to Hunt's exact specifications. Hunt and Olmsted worked closely, but they operated on different clocks. Hunt's house would take approximately 5 years to complete. Olmsted's forest would take decades to mature. Both men understood they were creating something meant to outlast them. Both understood the scale of the investment required. And both, though neither said so publicly, harbored a quiet question. Could even Vanderbilt wealth sustain this level of ambition indefinitely? Construction began in 1890. The house would open for Christmas 1895. What unfolded across those 5 years was equal parts artistry, engineering, and endurance. The work began with earth and stone. Before Hunt's chateau could rise, the ground had to be made ready. The chosen plateau stood high above the French Broad River Valley, but its surface was irregular, sloping, uneven. Crews began excavating foundations, cutting deep into mountain soil. The basement level would house the estate's mechanical organs, boilers, coal storage, kitchens, cold storage, laundries, storerooms. The excavation was extensive. Thousands of cubic yards of earth had to be moved. Men wielded picks and shovels. Mules pulled carts. Sweat and muscle moved the mountain. Then came the stone. Limestone blocks arrived by rail from quarries near Bedford, Indiana. Each block was numbered and tagged according to Hunt's architectural drawings. These were not simple rectangles. Many arrived pre-carved with arched surrounds, ornamental brackets, rosettes, and decorative details. Stonemasons set each piece methodically, course by course, following the plans with precision. Mortar was mixed on site in careful proportions. In fair weather, the walls climbed a few courses per week. Rain slowed progress. Winter cold made mortar curing unpredictable, but the work continued. The Italian stonemasons worked with techniques honed over generations. They understood how to cut stone so it carried structural load, how to shape voussoirs so an arch would lock itself under compression, how to carve profiles that would shed water and weather gracefully over centuries. Speed was never the priority. The mandate was durability. Hunt required tight joints and true lines. The masons delivered both. As the exterior walls rose, other crews threaded the interior with modern systems. Biltmore would have electricity throughout, still a luxury in 1890, still rare outside major cities. Installing electric wiring in a building of this size was a complex undertaking. Standards were young and inconsistent. Engineers designed a bespoke electrical system with a generator housed in a separate building to reduce fire risk. Major rooms received electric chandeliers and sconces. Bedrooms were fitted with call buttons that rang bells in the service areas, summoning staff when needed. The technology was cutting edge. Integrating it into a structure designed to evoke medieval France required careful coordination. Heating was equally demanding. Central heating was rare in any private residence, almost unheard of at this scale. The system designed for Biltmore relied on massive coal-fired boilers in the basement. These boilers heated water, which circulated through miles of iron pipes to radiators in every room. Maintaining consistent temperature in a building with 4 acres of floor space, stone walls that held cold, and high ceilings that let heat rise required constant monitoring. Coal deliveries became routine. The boilers consumed tons every week in winter. Engineers had to remain on staff year-round to tend the equipment, regulate pressure, and prevent failures. Comfort, it turned out, carried a steep and ongoing price. Steady fuel, steady oversight, steady expense. Woodwork added another layer of craft and cost. Oak, chiefly American white oak, provided strength and beautiful figure. The library alone required carved paneling from floor to ceiling, a coffered ceiling with hand-painted details, and a concealed spiral staircase to reach the upper gallery where more books were shelved. Carpenters labored for months on that single room. The banquet hall's triple fireplace rose nearly to the rafters, a massive construction that married carved limestone and oak in a display meant to awe. Guest bedrooms received custom joinery. Bathrooms, more than 40 in total, were fitted with tile underfoot and on walls, porcelain fixtures, and hot and cold running water. This was extraordinary for the time. Most rural homes still relied on outhouses and wash basins. Biltmore had full plumbing throughout. The human cost of construction is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The labor was punishing. Stone dust filled lungs. Heights were unforgiving. Accidents happened. Men fell from scaffolding. Hands were crushed under heavy blocks. Saw blades claimed fingers. The work continued 6 days a week, 10-hour days in most seasons. Winters were brutal. Cold bit through coats. Work slowed but rarely stopped entirely. George wanted the house finished. The deadline was fixed. Christmas 1895. Pressure flowed downhill. Foremen pushed crews. Crews pushed themselves. Some men slept in temporary barracks on the estate. Others walked miles from Asheville each morning before dawn and trudged home after dark. Payroll ledgers preserved in the Biltmore archives record hundreds of names. Stonemasons earned more than common laborers. Skill commanded a premium. Carpenters and plasterers drew daily rates that reflected their training. Unskilled laborers, men who hauled materials, mixed mortar, and cleared debris, earned less but still found the work attractive. Jobs were scarce in western North Carolina. Biltmore offered steady wages. Women worked too, though their labor is less documented. They staffed the estate kitchens and laundries, feeding construction crews and washing their clothes. These were not light tasks. Feeding 1,000 men required industrial-scale cooking. Laundry meant hauling water, heating it over fires, scrubbing heavy work clothes, and drying them in all weather. The work was hard, invisible, and essential. By 1894, the house was weathertight. The roof, thousands of copper sheets carefully seamed, was complete. It would weather over decades into the distinctive blue-green patina that still catches light today. Inside, plasterers closed walls with smooth white coats. Painters applied layer after layer to trim and ceilings. Electricians tested circuits. Plumbers pressure-tested lines. Tile setters moved methodically from bathroom to bathroom. Furniture was ordered from specialized workshops. Art was purchased in Europe or drawn from George's growing collection. Books, thousands of them, were unpacked from crates and placed on library shelves. The house was becoming inhabitable. Christmas 1895 was the target. George wanted to host family and friends. He wanted to show what he had created. The deadline was met, though barely. Workers were still finishing touches as guests arrived. But even as the last fixtures were installed, another part of George's vision was only beginning. The house was finished. The forest was broken. And healing that forest would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions George Vanderbilt ever made. Not for himself, for the nation. Christmas of 1895 was triumphant. The house glowed with electric light. Fires warmed every room. Music filled the winter garden. Guests marveled at the scale, the beauty, the technology. But when George stood in his library, surrounded by 10,000 carefully selected volumes, and looked out the tall windows toward the mountains, he saw something that troubled him. Close to the house, Olmsted's work was thriving. The approach road wound through carefully restored woodland. Formal gardens supplied structure and seasonal color. But beyond that cultivated ring, the wider estate told a different, harsher story. The land was damaged. Decades of exploitative logging had stripped the mountains. Lumber companies had taken the best trees, the straightest, tallest trunks, and left slash piles to rot or burn. Farmers had cleared steep slopes for corn and tobacco, crops that drained thin mountain soils within a few seasons. When yields collapsed, they abandoned the fields and moved on. Erosion tore gullies down hillsides. After every storm, streams ran brown with silt. The native forest, once rich with American chestnut, a cornerstone species that provided food for wildlife and valuable timber for humans, was fragmented and degraded. George wanted more than a handsome view. He wanted a living, productive forest. He wanted proof that scientific management could restore abused land while generating sustainable income. Properly managed timber could help offset the estate's massive operating costs. But there was a problem. In America in the 1890s, forestry as a profession barely existed. Europe, particularly Germany and France, had practiced scientific forest management for generations. They had schools, trained specialists, tested methods, centuries of accumulated knowledge. America had loggers. The difference was fundamental. Logging was extraction. Cut, haul, sell, move on. Forestry was stewardship. Assess, plan, harvest selectively, regenerate, sustain. George wanted a forester. He consulted Frederick Law Olmsted, who recommended a young American who had just returned from studying forestry in Europe. His name was Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was 26 years old when George hired him in 1892, even before the house was complete. He was energetic, idealistic, and eager to prove that European forestry techniques could be adapted to American conditions. Pinchot surveyed the Biltmore Estate and saw both a crisis and an opportunity. The crisis was the condition of the land. The opportunity was the scale. 125,000 acres offered room to experiment, to test methods, to demonstrate what American forestry could become. Pinchot's approach was systematic. First came a comprehensive inventory. What tree species were present? Where were the healthiest stands? Where was natural regeneration taking hold? Which areas were most severely degraded? Survey crews walked the estate for months, marking trees, taking measurements, noting topography and soil conditions. Then came management decisions. Pinchot introduced selective cutting. Instead of clear-cutting entire hillsides, crews would harvest only mature trees ready for the sawmill, leaving younger growth to climb into the canopy. This approach maintained forest cover, reduced erosion, protected watersheds, and ensured future yields. He laid out fire breaks to prevent wildfires from racing unchecked through dry timber. In the most damaged areas, he launched reforestation efforts, planting thousands of seedlings, white pine, yellow poplar, oak, species chosen for their fitness to local conditions and their commercial value. This was practical working forestry, not ornamental landscaping. Pinchot hired local men to plant seedlings, thin overcrowded stands, and conduct controlled burns that cleared understory fuels and reduced wildfire risk. He cut roads and trails to reach remote forest compartments. He tested techniques, kept meticulous records, and refined methods based on results. The Biltmore Forest became a living laboratory, and it attracted attention. Foresters from Europe visited to observe. American land managers, the few who existed, took note. Here was proof that forests could be managed for long-term productivity, that exploitation was not the only option. Pinchot did not stay at Biltmore for long. By 1895, he had accepted a position with the federal government. He would eventually become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, shaping national forest policy for decades. But Biltmore had been his proving ground. The techniques refined on George Vanderbilt's mountains would influence how America managed millions of acres of public and private forest land. George replaced Pinchot with Carl Alwyn Schenk, a German-trained forester with both academic credentials and field experience. Schenk continued and expanded the forestry program. In 1898, he founded the Biltmore Forest School, the first forestry school in America. Students, many of them sons of wealthy families, others ambitious young men from modest backgrounds, lived on the estate and learned by doing. They marked trees for harvest. They calculated timber volumes. They laid out logging roads. They conducted prescribed burns. They studied soil science and tree diseases. They learned forest economics. The program was rigorous, practical, and visionary. The Biltmore Forest School operated for 15 years, from 1898 to 1913. It trained hundreds of foresters who carried scientific forest management principles across the United States. Some entered the newly formed U.S. Forest Service. Others took positions managing private timberlands. Still others became professors, teaching the next generation. A simple idea began to spread across the country. Forests could be productive and sustainable. Long-term stewardship outperformed short-term exploitation. Deliberate care yielded better economic and ecological outcomes than cut-and-run logging. This was arguably George Vanderbilt's most consequential achievement. The house impressed visitors and dominated postcards, but the forest changed an industry. It transformed how America thought about natural resources. It proved that private wealth, when guided by scientific principles and long-term thinking, could serve the public good. Yet both house and forest demanded constant funding. The bills never stopped, and that funding, reliable for now, depended entirely on George's ability to keep paying. The estate's productive enterprises, the dairy, the farms, the timber sales, generated revenue, but they could not cover the full cost of operations. The deficit had to be made up from George's investment income. As long as that income flowed steadily, the system worked. The question was how long it could last. Christmas 1895 marked a beginning, not an ending. The house was finished. Guests had come and gone, dazzled by what they had seen. But for George Vanderbilt, the real work was just starting. Biltmore was not a museum. It was a home, a working estate. And keeping it alive required constant attention, constant resources, constant vigilance. The numbers were sobering. More than 100 staff members were required to keep Biltmore functioning. Maids cleaned rooms, changed linens, polished silver, and guarded every surface. Footmen served meals, stoked fires in 65 fireplaces, and answered call buttons that rang throughout the house. Cooks prepared meals for family, guests, and staff. Laundresses wrestled mountains of sheets, towels, tablecloths, and clothing. Engineers tended boilers, monitored electrical systems, and handled repairs. Groundskeepers maintained the formal gardens, the miles of approach road, and the immediate landscape. Stable hands cared for horses and carriages. Foresters managed the timberlands. Each worker drew wages. Each department consumed supplies. The estate's monthly operating costs were substantial. Coal arrived by the carload to feed the hungry boilers. In winter, the house consumed tons per week. Provisions were purchased in bulk or produced on the estate's farms and dairies. Fresh milk, butter, cheese, vegetables, fruit, meat, and eggs. Some of this was sold to offset costs, but much of it fed the household and staff. Maintenance never slept. A structure this large always had something that needed attention. A slate tile loosened by wind, plaster cracked by settling, a pipe that froze and burst during a cold snap, a circuit that failed. Every repair required skilled labor and materials. Every fix cost money. George kept careful books. Ledgers preserved in the Biltmore archives itemize everything with precision. Salaries for each staff category, coal deliveries, food purchases, repairs to roofs, walls, plumbing, and wiring. Property taxes, insurance premiums. The figures are detailed and daunting. Annual operating costs ran to approximately $250,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $7 million in today's terms, every year, year after year. The estate's income-generating activities shouldered part of the burden. The dairy was productive, one of the largest in North Carolina. Milk, butter, and cheese were sold in Asheville. The farms supplied vegetables, fruit, and meat, some for household use, the rest for sale. Timber sales from the managed forest provided a modest but steady stream of revenue. These productive arms mattered, but they could not equal the cost of running the house itself. The deficit had to be covered by George's investment income, dividends from railroad stocks, real estate holdings, bonds, and other financial instruments inherited from his father. By any standard, George was wealthy. His investment income was substantial, but the question was whether it was enough, whether it would always be enough. For about a decade, the balance held. The estate functioned smoothly. The house was a marvel. The forest program gained national attention. Biltmore Village, the planned community George built near the entrance gates to house workers and provide services, thrived. The village was designed by Richard Sharp Smith, Hunt's supervising architect, in an English cottage style. Brick and stucco construction, slate roofs, humane proportions, a church, a school, a hospital, shops, and cottages for workers and their families. George's labor policies were paternalistic but comparatively progressive for the time. Wages were paid reliably. Housing was maintained in good repair. The school educated workers' children without charge. Medical care was available at the estate hospital. George believed that well-treated workers were more productive and more loyal. It was sound business as well as basic decency. The result was a community whose living standards exceeded those of many southern mill towns and mining camps, places where exploitation was routine and conditions often brutal. Social life at Biltmore remained restrained. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898. She was intelligent, well-educated, and shared his preference for quiet gatherings over lavish spectacle. They entertained selectively, small dinners, weekend guests. Occasional concerts in the Winter Garden. Nothing approaching the extravagant costume balls held at Vanderbilt mansions in Newport, where orchestras played until dawn, champagne flowed by the case, and society columnists chronicled every excess. The restraint was partly temperament. George genuinely preferred books to crowds, scholarship to society. But it was also practical arithmetic. Every grand ball consumed thousands of dollars. Every house party required extra staff, extra provisions, extra coal. Operating costs were already heavy. Unnecessary display only worsened the financial equation. Daily operations at Biltmore ran on precise choreography. Staff worked in coordinated shifts so that fires were tended, meals prepared, and call buttons answered around the clock. A household manager, often called a majordomo or chief steward, coordinated schedules and maintained standards. Edith, as mistress of the house, oversaw domestic arrangements with the housekeeper. Linens, china, menus, guest accommodations. Detail by detail, the estate functioned like a self-contained town with its own rhythms and hierarchies. Supplies arrived by rail at the estate's private siding, then were moved by wagon to storerooms and distributed to departments. The estate had its own blacksmith shop for repairing tools and ironwork. A carpentry shop built furniture and handled joinery repairs. A garage housed automobiles. George was an early adopter of motor cars and understood they would eventually replace horse-drawn carriages. For a time, the system worked. Investment income covered the operational deficit. Farms and forests contributed what they could. The estate employed hundreds of people, supporting families across the region. Biltmore became Asheville's largest private employer and a source of civic pride. Tourism was beginning to grow. Wealthy Northerners discovered the Blue Ridge Mountains as a summer and autumn destination. Asheville's economy expanded. Hotels, shops, and services multiplied. Biltmore, though private and not open to visitors, contributed to the area's reputation as a cultured, sophisticated retreat. Yet the balance was fragile. Cash had to flow in an unbroken stream to meet obligations. Any shock to George's investment income, a market downturn, a recession, a change in tax policy, would bite immediately. There was little margin for error. The estate operated near its sustainable limit. George managed carefully, watching expenses, seeking efficiencies, refusing waste. He hoped that over time, the productive capacity of the farms and forest would continue to grow while operating costs stabilized or even declined. He was optimistic but not naive. He understood the risks. What he did not foresee were two shocks, one fiscal and one personal, that would fundamentally alter Biltmore's trajectory. The first shock came from Washington, and it would change the economics of wealth in America forever. By 1910, Biltmore had found a rhythm. The house had been operating for 15 years. Systems were settled, staff knew their roles, the dairy was productive. The forest, under Carl Schenk's management, generated timber income while visibly recovering from decades of abuse. Reforestation efforts were maturing. Erosion had slowed. Wildlife populations were returning. The Biltmore Forest School was training a new generation of American foresters. George and Edith had a daughter, Cornelia, born in 1900. The family divided time between Biltmore, their townhouse in Washington, D.C., and travel abroad. The estate looked stable. The dream felt secure. Then, in 1913, everything changed. Congress ratified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, authorizing a federal income tax. Until that moment, wealthy Americans paid relatively little in direct taxation to the federal government. Property taxes existed at the local level. Tariffs funded much of federal operations, but personal income largely went untaxed. This was the foundation on which Gilded Age fortunes had been built and maintained. The income tax altered the equation fundamentally. Rates began modestly. The initial law taxed incomes over $3,000 at 1%, with a surtax on higher incomes. For someone in George's position, the impact was immediate and substantial. A significant portion of his annual investment income, the money that covered Biltmore's operating deficit, now went to the federal treasury, and the rates would only climb. By the end of World War I, the top marginal rate exceeded 70%. George's income had not changed. But the share available to fund Biltmore had shrunk dramatically. The careful balance he had maintained, income versus operating costs, tipped. The house still demanded coal, wages, food, repairs, and supplies. Those costs did not fall, but the funds available to meet them had decreased. George read the monthly reports with mounting concern. For the first time since Biltmore opened, the estate was consuming capital, not just income. Cuts would be necessary. The question was where. Every department felt essential. Dismissing staff would degrade operations. Shuttering rooms would undermine the estate's purpose. Reducing support for the farms or forest would cut into the very revenue streams that helped. George began making adjustments. Travel was curtailed. New art and book purchases were deferred. Non-critical maintenance was postponed. Open staff positions were not always refilled. The changes were incremental, intended to preserve core functions while easing cash outflow. George believed he could navigate through the challenge. The income tax was a new reality, but the estate could adapt. Productivity could increase. Expenses could be trimmed further if necessary. With careful management and time, a new equilibrium might be reached. But time ran out. In March of 1914, George traveled to Washington, D.C. for medical consultations. He had been struggling with complications following an appendicitis surgery. The condition worsened suddenly. Surgeons operated under emergency circumstances. George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington on March 6, 1914. He was 51 years old. The news reached Biltmore by telegram. Staff, villagers, and the broader community felt the shock deeply. George had been a quiet, private man, but his vision had shaped everything. The house. the forestry program, hundreds of jobs, community institutions. His death created a void. For Edith, the loss was both intimate and operational. She had lost her husband, and she had inherited a massive, financially strained enterprise. George's will left Biltmore to Edith for her lifetime, with the estate passing to their daughter Cornelia upon Edith's death. The bequest included all assets, the house, the remaining land, the farms, the forests, and all the obligations that came with them. The debts, the payroll, the taxes, the endless maintenance. Edith sat at George's desk in the library, surrounded by his books, and reviewed the financial records. The picture was sobering. Monthly operating costs remained high and largely fixed. Revenue from the dairy, farms, and timber helped but fell far short of covering expenses. The deficit had always been made up from George's investment income. That income still existed. His estate was substantial, valued at millions, but settling the estate involved costs, legal fees, estate taxes. And the ongoing federal income tax would continue to reduce available cash. Edith faced a stark arithmetic reality. As currently operated, Biltmore cost more to run each year than it generated. Without significant changes, the estate would steadily draw down capital. Within a decade, perhaps less, the money would be gone. Once that happened, creditors and tax collectors would move in. The estate could be seized, auctioned, dismantled. Edith had a choice. She could try to maintain the estate exactly as George had envisioned, running it until the money ran out, ensuring eventual bankruptcy and forced sale. Or she could make hard, painful decisions immediately while she still had options to ensure that something of George's vision endured. She was 43 years old, a widow, a mother to a teenage daughter. The weight of responsibility was immense. Hundreds of families depended on Biltmore for their livelihoods. The house itself was architecturally significant, filled with museum-quality art and furnishings. The forestry program had national importance. Letting it all collapse was unthinkable, but preserving it in its current form was financially impossible. Edith understood something that many wealthy widows of her era did not. Sentiment could not pay bills. Love for a place, however deep, would not keep the boilers running or the staff paid. She needed a plan, and she needed to act quickly. The decisions Edith made over the next several years would determine whether Biltmore survived, and they would require sacrifices that George, with his Gilded Age assumptions about wealth and permanence, might never have imagined. Edith Vanderbilt was not naive. She had been married to George for 16 years. She understood the scale of Biltmore's operations and its costs, but understanding and managing were different things. George had handled the finances. Now that responsibility fell to her. And the numbers were unforgiving. She hired accountants and lawyers to conduct a comprehensive review of the estate's financial position. Their findings confirmed her fears and clarified her choices. Annual operating costs hovered around $250,000. Income from the dairy, farms, and timber sales covered roughly one-third of that. The remaining deficit, approximately $160,000 to $170,000 per year, had to come from investment income. George's estate generated that income, but after estate taxes, legal settlements, and ongoing federal income taxes, the surplus was thin, very thin. At the current rate of spending, capital reserves would be depleted within 8 to 10 years. Sooner if a major system failed and required expensive repairs. Once the capital was gone, Biltmore would face insolvency. Creditors could force a sale. The house, the land, the art, everything could be auctioned to the highest bidder. Edith weighed her options methodically. Option 1 was liquidation, sell everything immediately. The house, the furnishings, the land, live comfortably elsewhere on the proceeds, close the chapter. Many of her advisors urged this course. It was clean, final, safe. Edith refused. Biltmore was more than a house. It was George's life work. It employed hundreds of people in a region with limited economic opportunities. The architecture was irreplaceable. The art collection was world-class. The forestry program had reshaped an entire profession. Walking away felt like betrayal. Option 2 was partial liquidation. Keep the core, the house, and immediate grounds, and sell the rest. This would generate capital to pay down debts and create a financial cushion. It would also reduce the operational burden of managing a vast estate. Edith chose this path. In 1915, she began negotiations with the United States Forest Service. The federal government was actively seeking large tracts of land for the new national forest system. The Biltmore Estate, with its scientifically managed forests and proven potential for sustainable timber production, was exactly what the government wanted. The process took more than a year. Surveyors marked boundaries, appraisers determined value, lawyers drafted terms. Congressional appropriations had to be secured. Politics and bureaucracy added delays. Finally, in 1916, the transaction closed. Edith sold approximately 86,700 acres to the federal government, nearly two-thirds of the original estate. The government paid a fair price, though less than George had invested in purchasing and improving the land. The sale established what would become Pisgah National Forest, named for Mount Pisgah, the prominent peak visible from Biltmore's terraces. The transaction achieved multiple objectives. It generated capital to retire debts and stabilize the estate's financial position. It ensured that George's forestry work would continue under federal stewardship, managed according to the principles he had championed, and it reduced the operational burden to a manageable scale. Edith retained approximately 8,000 acres surrounding the house and village, still substantial, but far more manageable than the original 125,000. She could now concentrate resources on the core, the house, the gardens, the immediate landscape, without the crushing expense of managing tens of thousands of acres of forest. Next came operational cuts. This was painful but necessary. Staffing levels fell gradually through attrition and selective layoffs. Edith tried to soften the impact. She provided severance where possible, wrote letters of reference, helped displaced workers find positions elsewhere, but the reductions were real and felt across the estate. Household staff, which had numbered well over 100 at Biltmore's peak, shrank to approximately 60. Still a large staff by any measure, but sustainable given the reduced financial circumstances. Departments were consolidated. Roles were combined. Efficiency became the watchword. Maintenance was triaged. Essential systems, heating, electricity, plumbing, structural integrity went to the front of the line. Cosmetic work, repainting, refinishing, decorative repairs could wait. Unused wings of the house were closed off. Vents and radiators were shut to conserve coal. Dust covers went over furniture. Doors were locked. The goal was to mothball sections without letting them deteriorate. The formal gardens, which required intensive labor to maintain Olmsted's original vision, were simplified. Plantings were reduced. Seasonal displays were scaled back. The approach road and immediate grounds remained pristine, but the outer garden areas reverted to lower maintenance landscapes. Edith also cut her own spending drastically. Guest lists narrowed. Entertaining, never lavish under George, became rare. Travel was reduced to the essential. Personal expenditures dropped. She focused on two priorities: Cornelia's education and upbringing, and keeping Biltmore solvent. Her management style was calm, unsentimental, and detail-oriented. She reviewed ledgers monthly. She questioned every significant expenditure. She sought competitive bids for supplies and services. She negotiated with vendors. Restoring Biltmore to George's original vision was no longer feasible or even desirable. The goal now was lean continuity. A smaller, simpler operation that could live within its means while preserving the house and its most important functions. Through the late 1910s and into the 1920s, the strategy worked. The estate stabilized financially. Bills were paid on time. Staff received their wages. The house was maintained adequately, if not lavishly. Cornelia grew into a young woman. In 1924, she married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British aristocrat. The wedding was held at All Souls Church in Biltmore Village. It was a major social event, drawing attention from national newspapers. Cornelia and John settled at Biltmore and began raising a family. Two sons were born, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil in 1925 and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil in 1928. The estate, for a time, felt hopeful. Edith had saved it. The next generation was in place. The future seemed secure. Then, in October of 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began, and Edith faced a crisis that would dwarf everything that had come before. The crash came suddenly. In late October 1929, stock prices on Wall Street collapsed. Fortunes evaporated. Banks failed. Businesses shuttered. Unemployment soared. An economy that had felt prosperous and stable through the roaring 20s revealed its fragility. Within months, the United States plunged into the deepest economic crisis in its history. The Great Depression. Biltmore was not immune. The investments that underwrote the estate's income lost value. Dividends shrank or disappeared. The cash flow Edith depended on to cover operating costs became erratic and insufficient. At the same time, the Depression devastated Asheville and western North Carolina. Tourism, which had grown steadily through the automobile-friendly 1920s as Americans took motor trips into the scenic Blue Ridge, vanished almost overnight. Vacations were a luxury. In the Depression, luxuries disappeared. Hotels stood empty, restaurants closed, shops struggled. Unemployment in the region climbed above 20%. Edith reviewed the estate's financial position with growing alarm. Income had fallen sharply. Expenses, though far leaner than in George's day, remained substantial. The dairy and timber sales brought in revenue, but nowhere near enough to bridge the gap. Further cuts were possible: dismiss more staff, close more rooms, postpone all but the most urgent repairs, but there was a floor beneath which the house itself would begin to fail. Stone buildings demand constant care. Neglect invites water intrusion. Water causes rot, rust, and structural damage. Plaster cracks and falls. Small problems become catastrophic. A few years of underfunded maintenance could require decades and a fortune to reverse. Edith considered selling the house. Real estate brokers floated proposals. Break up the remaining land for residential development. Sell the furnishings at auction. Find a buyer for the house itself, perhaps an institution, a hotel company, a school. But who would buy in the depths of the Depression? And what institution could afford to operate a building this size? The house was too large, too expensive, too impractical for almost any conceivable use except the one George had intended. A private residence for a very wealthy family, and there were few families left with that kind of wealth and the willingness to take on such a burden. Then someone, the precise origin remains unclear in the historical record, suggested something radical, something almost scandalous. Open Biltmore to paying visitors. Let the public tour the house. Charge admission. Use the revenue to cover operating costs. For Edith's social class and generation, the idea was nearly unthinkable. Privacy was sacred. The notion of strangers walking through your home, studying your possessions, commenting on your taste, felt like a profound violation. It was the kind of thing impoverished European aristocrats did when they could no longer afford to maintain their estates. It was not something Vanderbilts did, but Edith was pragmatic. She had already sold 2/3 of George's land. She had cut staff, simplified operations, and reduced her own standard of living. Opening the house to tourists was simply the next logical adaptation, and it offered something beyond immediate financial relief. Asheville desperately needed economic activity. If Biltmore could draw tourists, those visitors would stay in local hotels, eat in local restaurants, shop in local stores. The ripple effect could provide jobs and income across the struggling community. Biltmore itself would need to hire guides, ticket sellers, and additional maintenance staff to handle visitor traffic. At a moment of nearly universal unemployment, this could make a tangible difference. Edith decided. Biltmore would open to the public. The opening was set for March 1930, just months after the crash. Preparations moved quickly but carefully. A visitor route was mapped through the house, covering the principal public rooms while keeping private family quarters off limits. Entrance hall, banquet hall, library, winter garden, breakfast room, and a selection of bedrooms on the upper floors. Ropes and stanchions were installed to guide foot traffic and protect furnishings. Staff were trained to answer questions and manage crowds. Tickets were printed. Advertising ran in regional newspapers and travel publications. Admission was set at $1 per person, a significant sum in 1930, equivalent to roughly $20 today, but not prohibitively expensive for middle-class visitors. The tour would take approximately 2 hours. Visitors would enter through the main front doors, follow a prescribed route, and exit through a side door. The experience was designed to be self-guided, with staff stationed in key rooms to provide information and ensure nothing was damaged. Opening day carried real uncertainty. Would anyone come? Would people in the depths of the Depression spend $1 to tour a mansion? Would the experience inspire or alienate? Would Americans see Biltmore as a symbol of excess or as a monument to craftsmanship and vision? The response exceeded expectations. Visitors came from Asheville and surrounding towns. Some arrived on foot. Others drove, despite gasoline being a carefully rationed expense. A few came by bus, part of organized group tour. They paid their $1. They stepped through the front doors, and they entered a world most had only imagined. They stood in the entrance hall and looked up at stone climbing 3 stories. They walked into the banquet hall and stared at the 70-foot ceiling and the massive triple fireplace. They lingered in the library among 10,000 books. They studied paintings, tapestries, carved woodwork, and ornamental details. They saw technology that was still rare in 1930, electric lights, central heating, multiple bathrooms with hot and cold running water. The reactions were mixed but mostly positive. Some visitors came out of simple curiosity. Some came because they or their relatives had worked on the estate and wanted to see the results of that labor. Some came for a brief escape from the grinding hardship of the Depression, a reminder that beauty and craft still existed in the world. The revenue was modest but meaningful. More importantly, the model worked. Biltmore had found a new identity, not a private home, a museum, a public attraction, a destination. The estate had learned to serve, and in serving it had discovered a path to survival. Through the 1930s, tourism at Biltmore ebbed and flowed with the economy. In the worst years, attendance was thin. As conditions improved slightly in the late 1930s, more people came. The income helped stabilize the estate, though it never provided abundance. Edith continued to manage carefully, balancing maintenance needs against ticket revenue, always aware that a single bad season could trigger a financial crisis. Then came December 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II, and Biltmore would find yet another unexpected purpose. The war changed everything. Almost overnight, civilian tourism ceased. Gasoline was rationed. Rubber for tires was scarce. Automobile travel for leisure became nearly impossible. Young men left for military service. Families focused on survival, not vacations. The visitors who had sustained Biltmore through the Depression vanished. Edith watched ticket sales collapse and braced for another financial crisis. Then, in early 1942, she received an unusual inquiry. It came from the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. The gallery had a problem. Its collection included some of the most important and valuable works of art in America. Paintings by old masters, rare sculptures, historic documents. With the nation at war and fears of bombing or sabotage in the capital, the gallery's leadership sought a secure location to store its most precious pieces. The requirements were specific and demanding. The site needed to be inland, far from coastal cities that might be targeted. It required climate control, stable temperature, and humidity to protect fragile canvases and documents. It needed security, isolation, and restricted access. And it needed large rooms with high ceilings to accommodate hundreds of wooden crates. Biltmore met every requirement. The house sat deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, far from ports and strategic targets. The rooms were vast. The structure was stone, largely fireproof. The mountain climate was cool. George's heating system, now nearly 50 years old but still functional, could regulate interior temperature. The estate was private, gated, and accessible only by a limited number of roads that could be easily monitored. Negotiations proceeded quietly and quickly. Security was paramount. Few people were informed of the details. In early 1942, the first shipments arrived. Trucks rolled through Biltmore's gates at night, headlights dimmed, carrying wooden crates stenciled only with identification numbers. Armed guards accompanied the convoys. The crates were unloaded through service entrances and carried into designated rooms, primarily the music room on the first floor and several large bedrooms on the upper floors. These spaces had minimal exterior windows, stable temperatures, and sufficient floor area for safe stacking. The contents of those crates were extraordinary. Few people at Biltmore knew the specifics. Those who did were sworn to secrecy. But after the war, when the story could be told, it became clear what had been sheltered in those darkened rooms. Paintings by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, and Gilbert Stuart. Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the image that appears on the $1 bill, was among the works stored at Biltmore. Sculptures, rare manuscripts, objects worth, in aggregate, tens of millions of dollars. A significant portion of America's artistic heritage sat in crates in a North Carolina mansion while war raged across Europe and the Pacific. Security was discreet but serious. Armed guards, dressed in civilian clothing to avoid drawing attention, patrolled the house and grounds around the clock. Staff understood that something important was being stored. They were told not to discuss it. Edith herself rarely entered the storage rooms. Representatives from the National Gallery visited periodically to inspect conditions, check temperature and humidity, and ensure the crates remained secure and undamaged. The arrangement continued through 1942, 1943, and into 1944. Biltmore, the house built for beauty and private contemplation, now served as a wartime vault. The winter garden fountain still ran. Lights still glowed softly in the library, but the halls were quieter than they had been in decades. Few visitors, minimal social activity, guards on rounds, and crates holding masterpieces that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands or be destroyed by bombs. For Edith, the arrangement provided several benefits. The government paid rent, not a fortune, but reliable income during a period when tourism had ceased entirely. Federal guards effectively secured the entire estate at no cost to her. Most importantly, the partnership affirmed Biltmore's significance. The house was not merely a relic of Gilded Age excess. It was a national asset, trusted to protect irreplaceable cultural treasures in a moment of existential crisis. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The war in the Pacific ended in August. As peace returned, the National Gallery began the process of retrieval. Crates were carefully loaded onto trucks. Convoys departed for Washington under guard. The rooms at Biltmore were emptied, cleaned, and restored to their original purposes. The art had survived the war unscathed. Not a single piece was damaged. Biltmore had proven itself not only as a home or a tourist attraction, but as a guardian of beauty in a time of darkness. Edith recognized something essential in that role. Biltmore could serve larger purposes. If it could serve, it had value beyond George's private vision, and if it had value, it deserved to endure. The question was how to secure that endurance permanently. The answer would require thinking beyond her own lifetime and beyond traditional models of private ownership. Edith guided Biltmore through the 1940s and 1950s with steady hands. Tourism resumed after the war. The post-war economic boom brought prosperity. Middle-class Americans bought cars and took family vacations. Biltmore became a popular destination. Visitation grew steadily, but Edith was aging. Born in 1873, she was in her 70s by the early 1950s. The question of Biltmore's long-term future could no longer be postponed. Her daughter Cornelia had married, divorced, and remarried. She spent much of her time away from Biltmore. The next generation, Cornelia's sons George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil and William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil, would inherit the estate and the responsibility of deciding what it should become. There was no clear path forward. The house was massive, expensive, and increasingly complex to maintain. Tourism generated revenue, but not the kind of capital needed for major repairs or long-term preservation. The estate existed in a precarious balance, financially solvent but brittle, always one major failure away from crisis. In 1963, Biltmore was designated a National Historic Landmark. This formal recognition affirmed its architectural and cultural importance. But designation brought obligations. This was not just a private house anymore. It was part of the nation's heritage. Letting it deteriorate was unthinkable. William Cecil, who took primary responsibility for managing Biltmore, understood that survival required professionalization. Biltmore could not continue operating as a private home that occasionally opened its doors to tourists. It had to function as a business, a cultural institution. A professionally managed operation with strategic planning, marketing, and diversified revenue streams. Change came deliberately through the 1960s and 1970s. Tourism was expanded and refined. Visitor facilities improved. Parking areas, restrooms, ticketing systems, and gift shops were developed. Marketing became more sophisticated. Advertising reached beyond the region. Group tours were courted. Special events were introduced. Seasonal programming, Christmas candlelight tour, spring garden celebrations, summer concerts brought repeat visitors and created new revenue opportunities. The winery, established in 1985, added both income and a reason to visit. North Carolina's wine industry was in its infancy. Biltmore's entry was bold and well executed. The estate's vineyards, planted on land George had once envisioned for agriculture, produced quality grapes. The winery became a destination within a destination. Farm operations continued, now with produce and products sold directly to visitors in estate shops. The goal was to make every aspect of the estate contribute financially. Expansion demanded careful restraint. More visitors meant more wear on historic structures. Every person who walked through the house added moisture to the air, tracked grit across floors, and touched surfaces. The challenge was to maximize income while minimizing harm. Preservation became systematic and continuous. This was not a one-time restoration project. It was a permanent commitment. The copper roof, now more than a century old, required sections to be repaired or replaced. Limestone walls needed cleaning and conservation. Pollution and weather had softened carved details in places. Conservators used gentle techniques to remove grime without damaging stone. Interior oak floors and paneling needed refinishing. Plaster required ongoing patching and repainting. Textiles, tapestries, upholstery, curtains were fragile and light-sensitive. Some were rotated out of display for conservation treatment. Others were replaced with careful reproductions. Electrical and plumbing systems dating to the 1890s had to be modernized. This work was delicate. Modern systems had to be integrated without destroying historic fabric or altering the building's character. Wiring was threaded through existing chases. Pipes were replaced in sections. Climate control was upgraded to protect furnishings and art while reducing energy consumption. The work was painstaking and expensive. Skilled craftspeople were required, stonemasons who understood historic techniques, plasterers who could match original finishes, conservators trained in treating fragile materials. Some specialists were brought in from outside, others were trained on site. Biltmore became a center for preservation crafts, passing skills to a new generation. Materials had to match originals as closely as possible. Replacement stone came from the same Indiana quarries. Plaster recipes were analyzed and replicated. Paint colors were matched to original samples found beneath later layers. Every project began with research, moved through careful planning, and ended with rigorous quality control. Modern technology was integrated carefully. Climate control systems, upgraded fire suppression, and security systems with cameras and alarms were installed discreetly. Solar panels on outbuildings, screened from public view, helped reduce operating costs without disturbing historic sight lines. Energy efficiency became a priority, not for ideological reasons, but for practical ones. Lower energy costs meant more resources for preservation. The forestry legacy continued. The remaining woodlands, though much reduced from George's original holdings, were managed sustainably. Timber was harvested selectively. Reforestation and habitat restoration work continued. The principles established more than a century earlier by Gifford Pinchot and Carl Schenck remained relevant and operational. By the early 21st century, Biltmore had become one of the most visited historic houses in America, drawing more than 1 million guests annually. The estate employed approximately 2,000 people, far more than George's original staff, and ranked among the region's largest private employers. The economic impact on Asheville and western North Carolina was substantial. Hotels, restaurants, shops, and service businesses thrived on Biltmore-driven tourism. The transformation was complete. Biltmore had begun as one man's private refuge, realized with Gilded Age capital and singular vision. It survived through painful adaptation, through Edith's hard choices and the family's willingness to share what had been intensely private. The house George built for solitude and scholarship now served millions. The forest he healed for science now welcomed hikers, naturalists, and students. The estate that once strained even Vanderbilt resources now sustained thousands of livelihoods. Here is what the guided tour do not tell you. Here is what the glossy brochures and the official history omit. Biltmore is beautiful. Biltmore is impressive. And Biltmore was built on a system of labor exploitation that was standard for its time but unconscionable by any moral measure. Let's be clear about what happened. More than 1,000 men worked on Biltmore's construction. They labored 6 days a week, 10 hours a day in conditions that were dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly. Stone dust filled their lungs, causing respiratory diseases that would kill them years later. Heights were unforgiving. Men fell from scaffolding. Accidents were common, hands were crushed, fingers were severed, backs were broken. There was no workers' compensation, no health insurance, no safety regulations. If a man was injured and could not work, he was dismissed. If he died, his family received nothing. The skilled workers, stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, earned decent wages for the era. But the unskilled laborers, the men who hauled stone, mixed mortar, dug foundations, and cleared debris, earned barely enough to survive. They lived in crude barracks or walked miles each day from Asheville. Their names appear in payroll ledgers, their stories do not. The women who worked in the laundries and kitchens, feeding and clothing the construction crews, worked just as hard for even less pay. Their labor was considered unskilled, therefore cheap. They hauled water, heated it over fires, scrubbed heavy work clothes by hand, and hung them to dry in all weather. This was back-breaking work. It was essential, and it was invisible. After the house opened, the exploitation continued in a different form. The household staff, more than 100 people at the peak, worked long hours for modest wages. Maids rose before dawn to light fires and prepare rooms before the family woke. They worked until late evening, cleaning up after dinners and social events. They had one day off per week if they were lucky. They lived in small, unheated rooms in the attic or basement. They ate leftover food in the servants' dining hall. They used separate, unadorned staircases so they would not be seen by family or guests. This was the standard arrangement in Gilded Age households. That does not make it just. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Upstairs, beauty, comfort, warmth, and abundance. Downstairs, utility, cold, and scarcity. Two worlds under one roof, separated by class and power. George Vanderbilt was not a cruel man by the standards of his time. By those standards, he was relatively enlightened. He paid fair wages, he provided housing, he built schools and a hospital in Biltmore Village, but fairness is relative. George spent roughly $5 million building a house for his private use. That is more than $150 million in today's terms. He spent it on stone, oak, marble, copper, and art. Meanwhile, the men who built that house earned a few dollars a day and lived in barracks. The moral arithmetic is uncomfortable, and it should be. This is not to single out George Vanderbilt. He was typical of his class. Every Gilded Age mansion was built the same way. Every great estate rested on the labor of people who would never live in such comfort themselves. But recognizing that this was common does not make it acceptable. It makes it systemic. And systemic injustice is the most dangerous kind because it becomes invisible, normalized, woven into the fabric of society until it feels natural. The financial history of Biltmore reveals another uncomfortable truth. The estate survived because Edith was willing to make sacrifices. But those sacrifices fell disproportionately on the people with the least power. When cuts were necessary, staff were dismissed. Workers lost their jobs. Families lost their income. Edith provided severance and references when she could. That was decent of her, but decency does not pay rent or buy food. The people who built Biltmore and kept it running for decades were discarded when they became inconvenient. This, too, was standard practice. That does not make it right. Opening Biltmore to the public in 1930 is often portrayed as a bold, innovative decision. It was, but it was also an act of desperation. Edith opened the house because she had no other choice. And the decision to charge admission to turn the house into a tourist attraction was predicated on the assumption that Biltmore belonged to the Vanderbilts. That George's wealth gave him the right to build it. That Edith's inheritance gave her the right to control it. But where did that wealth come from? Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, built his fortune through steamship and railroad monopolies. He crushed competitors. He exploited workers. He bribed politicians. He operated in an era before antitrust laws, before labor protections, before any meaningful regulation of corporate power. The Vanderbilt fortune was built on systems that extracted wealth from workers and communities and concentrated it in the hands of a single family. George's share of that fortune, the money that built Biltmore, was not earned in any conventional sense. It was inherited. It was the product of systems designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. This is not a comfortable history, but it is the true history. And if we are going to celebrate Biltmore, if we are going to marvel at its beauty and craftsmanship, we have an obligation to acknowledge the full cost. Not just the dollar cost, but the human cost. The broken bodies, the exhausted lives, the families displaced when the estate could no longer afford to employ them. There is another layer to this story. The land George purchased, 125,000 acres, was not empty. People lived on that land. Families farmed it. Communities had roots there. When George bought their land, often at prices they could not refuse, those people were displaced. Some moved to Asheville and found work in factories or mills. Others left the region entirely. Their names do not appear in the Biltmore archives. Their stories were not recorded. They simply vanished from the historical record as if they had never existed. This, too, was common practice in the Gilded Age. Land was a commodity. People were obstacles. If you had enough money, you could buy anything, including the erasure of entire communities. George Vanderbilt probably did not think of it that way. He saw empty, degraded land and an opportunity to restore it. But the land was not empty, and the people who lived there had no choice in the matter. The forestry program, which is rightly celebrated as visionary, also had a darker side. Scientific forest management required control. It required excluding people who had used those forests for generations. Local families hunted in those woods. They gathered firewood. They grazed livestock. When George fenced the land and hired foresters to manage it, those traditional uses ended. The forest was now private property managed for timber production and scientific study. The people who had depended on it were locked out. This is the paradox of conservation. Protecting land often means restricting access. And restricting access disproportionately harms the people with the least power, the people who cannot afford to buy their own land, who depend on common resources for survival. George's forestry program was scientifically advanced and ecologically beneficial. It was also an exercise of power that displaced and excluded the poor. Both things are true. History is not simple. People are not simple. George Vanderbilt genuinely loved the land. He wanted to restore it and protect it. He also wielded immense unearned wealth and used it in ways that harmed people with no power to resist. Edith Vanderbilt made painful sacrifices to save Biltmore. She also made decisions that cost workers their livelihoods. William Cecil professionalized the estate and ensured its survival. He also turned it into a commercial operation that prioritizes profit. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They coexist. And understanding that is essential to understanding Biltmore's true story. The house is beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The vision was ambitious. And the cost, the real cost, was borne by people whose names we do not know, whose stories were not recorded, whose suffering was considered the price of progress. If we are going to visit Biltmore, if we are going to admire it, we owe it to those people to remember them, to acknowledge that every stone in that house was set by hands that ached, that every fire in those 65 fireplaces was lit by someone who woke before dawn in an unheated room, that every elegant dinner was cooked by people who ate leftovers in a basement. Beauty has a cost. Progress has a cost. And in the Gilded Age, that cost was almost always paid by people who had no choice and received no credit. So what does it cost to make a house immortal? The numbers are staggering. Biltmore's initial construction cost approximately $5 million, over $150 million in today's terms. But that was only the beginning. Annual operating costs in George's era ran to $250,000. $7 million today, every year, year after year. After George's death, even with Edith's cuts, costs remained above $150,000 annually. In the 1930s, that was still a crushing burden. Today, Biltmore's annual operating budget exceeds tens of millions of dollars. The exact figure is not publicly disclosed. The estate is privately owned and does not release detailed financial information. But industry estimates suggest operating costs well above $40 to $50 million per year when you account for staffing, maintenance, utilities, insurance, marketing, and preservation work. Revenue from ticket sales, the winery, retail shops, restaurants, and special events covers those costs. Biltmore operates profitably now. But that profitability is recent and fragile. It depends on continued high visitation. Any disruption, a recession, a pandemic, a natural disaster could destabilize the equation. The preservation costs alone are immense. Stone conservation is expensive. Cleaning and repairing the limestone facade requires specialized contractors, scaffolding, and months of labor. A single section can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The entire exterior will require ongoing work for the rest of the building's life. The copper roof has a lifespan. Even copper, chosen for durability, eventually fails. Replacing sections, carefully matching the original, is costly and technically demanding. Interior finishes, plaster, paint, woodwork require constant attention. Climate control is expensive to install and expensive to operate. The systems required to protect fragile art and furnishings in a building this large consume enormous amounts of energy. Sustainability efforts help, but the baseline cost is high and permanent. Staffing is the largest single expense. Biltmore employs approximately 2,000 people. Guides, maintenance workers, gardeners, retail and hospitality staff, managers, marketers, preservationists, and administrators. Payroll alone runs to millions monthly. This is what it takes to keep Biltmore alive. Not just open, but alive, functioning as a living piece of history. The question George Vanderbilt could never answer was whether his fortune was big enough to sustain it indefinitely. The answer, as it turned out, was no. Even Vanderbilt wealth had limits. The income tax, introduced in 1913, shifted the balance permanently. Suddenly, a large share of the income that funded the estate went to the federal government. George's death a year later removed the guiding hand that had managed the estate's finances. Edith did her best, but she inherited a system already under strain. The Great Depression broke that system entirely. Only by opening the house to the public, by transforming it from a private home into a commercial operation, did Biltmore survive. That transformation saved the estate. But it also changed its nature fundamentally. Biltmore is no longer a home. It is a business, a museum, a tourist attraction, a venue. The house exists to serve visitors, to generate revenue, to justify its own continued existence. George's private library, where he read quietly surrounded by 10,000 books, now sees thousands of tourists pass through each week. The banquet hall, where he hosted small dinners, is rented for weddings and corporate events. The rooms he furnished with art and antiques are staged for maximum visual impact, optimized for Instagram, designed to generate the wow factor that brings repeat visitors and positive reviews. This is not a criticism. This is survival. This is the compromise required to keep a Gilded Age mansion alive in the 21st century. But it is a compromise. The house George envisioned no longer exists. What exists is something else. Something impressive and valuable, but different. There is a broader lesson here about wealth, legacy, and the limits of private ambition. George Vanderbilt believed that great wealth gave him the power to create something permanent, a house that would stand for centuries, a forest that would thrive under scientific care, a legacy that would outlast him. He was partially right. The house stands, the forest thrives, but the cost of keeping them alive has been borne by others, by workers who built it, by Edith, who sacrificed to save it, by William Cecil and his descendants, who turned it into a business, by the public, who now fund its operations through ticket sales, and by the estate itself, which surrendered its original purpose to survive. This raises uncomfortable questions. If preserving beauty requires transforming it into commerce, is it still the same beauty? If keeping a house alive means turning it into a tourist attraction, is it still a home? If a legacy only survives by abandoning the vision that created it, is it still a legacy? These are not rhetorical questions. They are real dilemmas faced by every historic property, every institution that tries to preserve the past while operating in the present. The answers are not simple. Biltmore survives because it adapted, but adaptation required sacrifice, and those sacrifices have costs that cannot be measured in dollars. There is also a question of justice. Biltmore is privately owned. The Cecil family, descendants of George Vanderbilt through his daughter Cornelia, controls the estate. They make the decisions, they reap the profits, and they bear the costs and risks. That is private ownership. But is it just? The house was built with wealth extracted through monopolistic business practices that would be illegal today. The labor that built it was exploited by standards we now recognize as unethical. The land it occupies was purchased from people who had little choice but to sell. Should the Cecil family profit from that history? Or does the estate, as a national historic landmark, belong in some sense to the public, regardless of who holds the title? There are arguments on both sides. Private ownership has kept Biltmore in excellent condition. The Cecil family has invested heavily in preservation. They have run the estate professionally and responsibly. Public ownership, by contrast, often leads to underfunding and neglect. Government budgets are tight. Historic properties compete for limited resources. Many publicly owned sites deteriorate because there is no money to maintain them. But private ownership also means that access is controlled and monetized. Visiting Biltmore is expensive. Ticket prices run to $70 or more per person. For a family, a visit can easily cost several $100s. That puts it out of reach for many people. The estate that was built with public labor on land purchased from common people is now accessible only to those who can afford the entry fee. Is that right? Is that the best way to preserve and share our cultural heritage? These questions have no easy answers, but they are worth asking, because Biltmore is not just a house. It is a symbol, a monument to Gilded Age ambition, yes, but also to the systems that made that ambition possible. Systems of concentrated wealth, labor exploitation, and unchecked power. Those systems built America. They also scarred it, and the scars remain visible if you know where to look. Biltmore is beautiful, Biltmore is impressive, and Biltmore is a reminder that beauty and injustice are not opposites. They coexist, often in the same place, often built by the same hands. Acknowledging that does not diminish the craftsmanship or the architectural achievement. It deepens our understanding of what it took to create and what it costs to sustain. So what can we learn from Biltmore's story? What does this house, this monument to Gilded Age excess and ambition, teach us about wealth, preservation, and the American dream? The first lesson is this: beauty alone is not enough. George Vanderbilt built something extraordinary. The architecture is world-class. The craftsmanship is museum quality. The vision was singular, but none of that guaranteed survival. Without adaptation, without painful compromise, Biltmore would have been sold, subdivided, or demolished decades ago. Beauty must be sustained, and sustaining beauty requires resources, planning, and the willingness to change. The second lesson: wealth is not permanent. The Vanderbilts were the richest family in America, by some measures the richest in the world, and even they could not sustain Biltmore in its original form. The income tax, the Great Depression, changing social norms, all eroded the financial foundation George had assumed would last forever. Fortunes are built. Fortunes are lost. Nothing is guaranteed. The third lesson: adaptation is survival. Edith's willingness to sell land, cut staff, and open the house to tourists saved Biltmore. William Cecil's decision to professionalize operations and diversify revenue turned the estate into a sustainable enterprise. Every step required abandoning part of George's original vision. But without those steps, nothing would have survived. Rigidity is death. Flexibility is life. The fourth lesson: preservation is a collective responsibility. Biltmore is privately owned, but its significance extends beyond the Cecil family. It is part of our shared cultural heritage. Preserving it and places like it requires public support, whether through tax incentives, grants, or simply the willingness to visit and spend. We cannot expect private owners to shoulder the full burden of maintaining historic properties. If we value these places, we must help sustain them. The fifth lesson: history is complicated. George Vanderbilt was not a villain. He was a product of his time, shaped by assumptions and systems we now recognize as unjust. He genuinely loved the land and wanted to restore it. He treated his workers better than many of his peers. He funded groundbreaking forestry programs. He created jobs and supported communities. And he also benefited from immense unearned wealth, built a monument to his own taste, and exercised power in ways that harmed people with no ability to resist. Both things are true. History does not offer heroes and villains. It offers human beings making choices within systems they did not create and often did not fully understand. Judging them requires context, nuance, and humility. The sixth lesson: the cost of grandeur is always paid by someone. Every great building, every ambitious project requires labor, resources, and sacrifice. In the Gilded Age, that cost was disproportionately borne by workers who had little power and received little credit. That remains true today, though the mechanisms have changed. When we admire Biltmore, we should remember the people who built it. Their hands shaped every stone. Their sweat soaked into the ground. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their work endures. Honoring that work means acknowledging the conditions under which it was performed. The seventh lesson: legacy is not what you build, it is what survives. George wanted a private retreat, a library, a managed forest. What survives is a tourist attraction, a wedding venue, a commercial operation. That is not failure, it is transformation. Legacy is not static, it evolves. The question is whether it evolves in ways that honor the original intention while serving new purposes. Biltmore has done that, imperfectly but successfully. The eighth lesson: nothing lasts without change. The institutions, the traditions, the buildings we want to preserve cannot be frozen in time. They must adapt to remain relevant. Biltmore adapted. It changed from a home to a museum, from a private estate to a public attraction, from a money-losing burden to a profitable enterprise. Those changes were painful. They were also necessary. Preservation is not about keeping things exactly as they were. It is about keeping them alive. The ninth lesson: wealth creates responsibility. If you inherit or accumulate significant resources, you inherit responsibility for how those resources are used. George used his wealth to build something beautiful. Edith used hers to preserve it. William Cecil used his management skills to sustain it. Each generation faced different challenges and made different choices, but the responsibility remained constant. Wealth is not just an asset, it is a trust. How you manage it matters, not just for yourself, but for everyone affected by your decisions. The 10th and final lesson: the American dream has a dark side. Biltmore embodies that dream: ambition, vision, the belief that with enough resources and determination, anything is possible. George proved that. He built a palace in the mountains. He restored a forest. He created a legacy. But that dream was made possible by systems of exploitation and concentration of wealth that left millions behind. The Gilded Age was a time of extraordinary progress and staggering inequality. Technological marvels and labor abuses, architectural masterpieces and grinding poverty. The dream was real, so was the nightmare. Both are part of our history, both deserve recognition, so here is the secret. The dark truth that Biltmore keeps, hidden beneath the beauty and the carefully curated history. Biltmore is not a monument to one man's vision. It is a monument to a system. A system that concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, extracted labor from the many, and created beauty at a cost most people could never afford and would never benefit from. George Vanderbilt did not build Biltmore alone. He did not pay for it alone. Yes, his money funded the construction. But that money came from his grandfather's monopolies, his father's business practices, and a legal and economic system designed to protect and expand the fortunes of the wealthy. and the labor came from men and women who had no choice, who worked because they needed to survive, who built something magnificent and received a pittance in return. Biltmore is beautiful, Biltmore is extraordinary, and Biltmore is a monument to inequality, to exploitation, to the idea that some people matter more than others, that their comfort, their taste, their legacy is worth more than the health, safety, and dignity of the people who serve them. That is the secret. That is the truth they do not tell you on the guided tour. And it is a truth we need to confront if we are going to understand not just Biltmore, but America. Because Biltmore is not an outlier. It is not an exception. It is a perfect example. It is the Gilded Age distilled into stone and oak. It is the American dream and the American nightmare coexisting under one roof. We can admire the craftsmanship. We can marvel at the architecture. We can appreciate the forestry program and the preservation efforts, but we cannot ignore the cost, the human cost, the moral cost, the cost that was paid by people who are not named on plaques, who are not mentioned in the official history, who were used and discarded when they were no longer needed. They built Biltmore. And Biltmore survives because people like Edith and William Cecil were willing to change it, to adapt it, to turn it into something George never intended. That transformation saved the house, but it also reveals a deeper truth. Nothing survives without change. No institution, no tradition, no building is permanent unless it serves the needs of the present, not just the past. Biltmore serves now. It employs thousands. It draws millions of visitors. It contributes to the regional economy. It preserves a piece of history. Those are real benefits. But the question remains, who benefits most? Who profits? Who decides? And who is left out? The answers matter because Biltmore is not just history. It is present. It is ongoing. Decisions are being made every day about how it is managed, who has access, what stories are told, and what stories are silenced. If we care about historic preservation, about cultural heritage, about justice, we have to ask those questions. We have to demand answers. We have to insist that the full story be told, not just the beautiful parts, but the ugly parts too. The exploitation, the displacement, the inequality, because that is the only way to learn from the past. That is the only way to build a future that does not repeat the same mistakes. Biltmore is a masterpiece. Biltmore is a warning, and if we are wise, we will take both seriously. The story of Biltmore is not over. The house stands. The forest grows. Visitors come and go. But the challenges that nearly destroyed it a century ago remain. Economic downturns, rising costs, changing tastes, climate change which brings more severe storms, hotter summers, and unpredictable weather that stresses historic buildings. All of these threaten Biltmore's long-term survival. The Cecil family remains committed to preservation. They have invested tens of millions in recent decades. They have hired experts, upgraded systems, and maintained high standards. But they are also running a business, and businesses exist to make money. The tension between preservation and profit is real. Every decision involves trade-offs. Spend more on conservation or expand the gift shop. Limit visitation to reduce wear or increase marketing to boost revenue. Restore a historic room to its original state or convert it to a rentable event space. These are not hypothetical dilemmas. They are daily realities, and there is no perfect answer. Only choices, each with consequences. The broader question is whether private ownership is the best model for preserving nationally significant historic properties. Biltmore has thrived under private management, but that is not guaranteed to continue. What happens when the current generation of the Cecil family passes control to the next? What happens if the estate faces a financial crisis? What happens if tastes change and visitors stop coming? Private ownership offers flexibility and responsiveness, but it also concentrates power and risk in a small number of hands. Public ownership, through the National Park Service or a similar agency, would distribute risk and ensure long-term stability. But it would also likely mean reduced funding, bureaucratic inefficiency, and slower decision-making. There is no perfect system, only imperfect choices. The challenge for places like Biltmore is to navigate those choices with wisdom, transparency, and a commitment to serving not just the current owners, but the broader public who consider these places part of their shared heritage. What is certain is this: Biltmore will only survive if it continues to change, if it adapts to new realities, new audiences, and new expectations. The house George built is gone. What remains is something else, something shaped by a century of compromise and transformation. And that is okay. That is survival. That is life. Buildings, like people, must grow and change or they die. The question is not whether Biltmore will change. It will. The question is whether those changes will honor the past while serving the future, whether they will be guided by greed or responsibility, whether they will tell the full story, the beautiful and the ugly, or only the parts that sell tickets. Those are choices, and they are being made right now, by the people who own Biltmore, by the people who visit, and by all of us, because this place in the end belongs to history, and history belongs to everyone. Why does Biltmore matter? Why spend 15,000 words dissecting the history of a mansion most of us will never own and can barely afford to visit? Because Biltmore is a lens, a way of seeing and understanding forces that shaped America and continue to shape it today. Concentrated wealth, labor exploitation, ambition and vision, adaptation and survival. The tension between private ownership and public good. All of these are present in Biltmore's story, and all of these remain urgent questions in our time. We live in a new gilded age. Wealth inequality has returned to levels not seen since the 1920s. Billionaires build vanity projects while millions struggle to afford housing, healthcare, and education. The systems that created the Vanderbilt fortune, monopolies, tax avoidance, political influence, have modern equivalents. The names have changed, the mechanisms have evolved, but the underlying dynamics remain. Biltmore reminds us where that leads: to beauty, yes, to innovation, yes, but also to exploitation, to inequality, to a world where some people live in palaces while others sleep in barracks. That is not inevitable. It is a choice. A choice made by policies, by laws, by the distribution of power and resources. We can choose differently. We can build a society where ambition and beauty do not require exploitation, where legacy does not depend on inherited wealth, where everyone has the opportunity to create, to build, to contribute. Biltmore shows us what is possible when resources and vision align, but it also shows us the cost of that alignment when it happens in a system designed to concentrate wealth and power. If we want to build new monuments, new institutions, new legacies, we have to ask: who pays? Who benefits? And who decides? Those questions matter, because the answers shape the world we live in. Biltmore is more than a house, it is a mirror. And if we look closely, we see ourselves reflected in it, our ambitions, our compromises, our failures, and our successes. We see what we value and what we ignore, what we celebrate and what we hide. That reflection is uncomfortable. It should be. History is not comfortable. Truth is not comfortable. But discomfort is where learning begins, where change becomes possible. So visit Biltmore if you can. Walk through the entrance hall and look up at the stone rising 3 stories. Stand in the banquet hall and imagine the fires burning in the triple fireplace. Sit in the library and think about the hands that carved the oak. But do not stop there. Ask who built it. Ask what it cost. Ask who paid the price. Ask what it means that this place exists, that it survived, and what lessons we should carry forward, because that is how we honor history. Not by romanticizing it, but by understanding it fully. Not by celebrating only the beauty, but by acknowledging the cost. Not by preserving buildings as museums frozen in time, but by letting them teach us how to build a better future. That is Biltmore's true legacy. Not the house itself, but the questions it forces us to ask. About wealth, about power, about beauty and justice, about what we build and what we leave behind. Those questions do not have easy answers, but they are the right questions. And asking them is the first step toward answers that matter. If this deep investigation into Biltmore's hidden history resonated with you, I need your help to continue this work. This video took weeks of research, digging through archives, reading historical accounts, and piecing together the stories that official histories leave out. Creating content like this requires time, resources, and a commitment to telling the full truth, not just the comfortable parts. Here is how you can support this channel and make more videos like this possible. First, like this video. It seems simple, but it matters. The algorithm rewards engagement. A like tells YouTube that this content is valuable, and that means more people will see it. Second, subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber is a vote of confidence. It tells me that this work matters to you, and it gives me the encouragement to keep going, even when the research is difficult and the stories are uncomfortable. Third, share this video. Send it to someone who loves history, post it on social media. Add it to a playlist. Word of mouth is powerful. Every share expands the reach and brings this story to people who need to hear it. Fourth, tell me in the comments what you want to see next. Which historic house should I investigate? The Breakers in Newport, where the Vanderbilts threw legendary parties. Hearst Castle in California, William Randolph Hearst's monument to ego and excess. Lyndhurst on the Hudson, another Gilded Age mansion with secrets. Or maybe something unexpected. A forgotten estate with a story waiting to be told. Let me know. Your input shapes the content I create. Fifth, consider supporting the channel directly if you are able. Platforms like Patreon allow viewers to contribute financially, which helps cover research costs, travel to archives, and the time required to do this work properly. Every contribution, no matter how small, makes a difference. Finally, engage with the ideas. This is not just entertainment. These are real questions about wealth, power, justice, and how we understand our history. Discuss them, debate them, challenge them. That is how ideas grow and change takes root. These historic houses are not just buildings. They are chapters in America's story, built by real people, paid for with real costs, preserved through real struggle. Every mansion has its shadows. Every dream has its price. And every story, when told fully, teaches us something about who we are and who we want to become. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Your support makes this work possible. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, keep asking questions, keep seeking truth, and keep remembering that history, like beauty, is never as simple as it seems.